The morning Eleanor Whitcomb was thrown out of Silas Brackett's house, the temperature had already dropped below freezing. She didn't own a coat. She stood in the hard-packed dirt of the yard, 15 years old. A flour sack dress against her skin. Boots 2 sizes too large, stuffed with newspaper that had gone soft and useless weeks ago. In her left hand, a canvas bag that held everything she owned in this world. 2 books. A paring knife wrapped in electrical tape. A photograph of her mother laughing under a dogwood tree in spring of 1929. 3 years before the world changed forever. Silas Brackett stood in the doorway, 51 years old, 3,000 acres of cattle land behind him. He spat tobacco juice onto his own kitchen floor, looked at the orphan girl he had taken in 2 years ago, and called her worthless. "Get out," he said. "You ain't worth the food I put in your belly." Eleanor didn't argue. She had learned that arguing with Silas Brackett was a kind of arithmetic that always came out the same. She picked up her bag. She walked to the end of the yard. She did not look back. She walked north, up into the smoky ridge, toward a cave nobody on earth knew existed. What she would build there over the next 48 years would change every life it touched. And the man who threw her out, years later he would stand at her door, hat in his trembling hands, and weep. This is her story. It was November of 1934. The Great Depression had been eating through the country for 5 years, with the slow patience of something that knows it has time. In Caldwell Hollow, the eating had been going on longer than that, because the Hollow had never been prosperous in the way that prosperity gets remembered. The families who had settled this particular crease in the eastern Tennessee highlands, they had come here because the land was cheap. The soil was thin, and nobody else had wanted it badly enough to fight for it. The Depression had not introduced suffering to Caldwell Hollow. It had simply removed the possibility of pretending the suffering wasn't there. Eleanor's father had not been from the Hollow. Edmund Whitcomb had come to Caldwell from a small college town in Virginia. He had taught secondary school science for 11 years, before the school's funding collapsed, and the position with it. He had brought his wife Margaret and his 8-year-old daughter to Tennessee, because a cousin had written that there was work and land to be had. By the time Edmund discovered the cousin had been optimistic by a considerable margin, the family was already there, and the money was already gone. Edmund had adapted. He was the kind of man who adapts, not by lowering his expectations, but by applying his full attention to whatever the situation in front of him actually required, which is a rarer quality than it sounds. He spent his evenings reading from his old textbooks, reading to Eleanor, the way other fathers read fairy tales, because he believed. With the particular conviction of a man who had spent his career trying to make knowledge feel real to young people, that the best gift he could give his daughter was the habit of understanding why things worked the way they worked. Margaret Whitcomb had her own curriculum. She was, by any honest accounting, the finest cook in 3 counties. She could explain in terms Eleanor could follow, by the time Eleanor was 9, why salt draws moisture from meat, why vinegar makes pastry crust flaky, why a proper stock requires a low simmer, rather than a rolling boil. She kept a sourdough starter. She had been maintaining it for 2 years, feeding it with patient regularity, as though it were a member of the household, which in some practical sense it was. She taught Eleanor to bake bread, before Eleanor was tall enough to knead dough without standing on a step stool. Then came the autumn of 1932. The typhoid came through the valley, efficiently, and without sentiment. It took Edmund Whitcomb first, on a Tuesday in late September. It took Margaret 8 days later. Eleanor was 13 years old. She had held her mother's hand through the fever. She had done everything she knew how to do, and a few things she invented on the spot, and none of it had been enough. Afterwards, she had sat in the kitchen of their small cabin for a long time, without moving, looking at the sourdough starter on the counter, in its crockery jar, still alive, still rising slightly in the September warmth, tended by no one. She fed it. She didn't make a decision about feeding it. Her hand simply knew it needed to be fed, and she fed it. Eleanor would not understand until much later that the small automatic act was a version of the same impulse. That would define the next 60 years of her life. Something was alive. It needed tending. She tended it. Silas Brackett had taken Eleanor in because Edmund had owed him $18 for a load of fence posts. That was what Silas said. For 2 years she scrubbed his floors, mended his fences, split firewood, hauled water from the creek in buckets that were sized for a grown man, and weighed when full more than Eleanor weighed dry. She cooked his meals according to his specifications, which meant simple and plain, without what he called fanciness. Once, in the spring of her first year, Eleanor had gathered wild thyme and ramps from the hillside behind the barn and added them to a pot of beef stew. That had been up to that point, exactly as gray and defeated as the rest of the meals she prepared under Silas's roof. The stew had become for about 45 minutes, something with flavor and life in it. Then Silas came into the kitchen. He lifted the lid. He smelled what was in the pot. He dumped the pot on the ground outside. He said she was putting on airs. He said her kind always did. He said in his house food was food, not a performance. Eleanor cleaned up the spilled stew without a word. She made him cornbread and beans. She did not add anything to them at all, which was what he wanted, which meant he didn't notice them, which was apparently the goal. What Eleanor did in the margins of Silas Brackett's supervision was different. Caldwell Hollow contained a number of families whose situation had moved past poverty into something more acute, something that showed up in the specific way children's clothing fit them, in the particular silence that falls over a household where there isn't enough to eat. Eleanor knew what that silence sounded like, so she began foraging. She had her father's knowledge of the local flora. The smoky ridge above Caldwell Hollow was full of edible things, if you knew where to look and when. She found ramps in the creek bottoms in early spring, pawpaws along the south-facing slopes in September, hickory nuts in the leaf litter under the ridgeline trees. She combined them with whatever she could spare from Silas's kitchen. She wrapped the results in cloth and left them on the doorsteps of the families she had identified as the ones who needed them most. She did not announce this. She wanted the packages to appear, the children to eat, and no one to be embarrassed by the transaction, which is why she left them at night and knocked on no doors. It worked for a while, until the families talked. The talk made its way. as talk in small communities always does, to Hattie Pruitt. Hattie ran the dry goods store at the bottom of the hollow. She mentioned it to Silas, in the way of someone sharing a pleasant piece of news. Silas did not take pride. Silas took offense. The offense was not about the missing food. It was about the praise being given to someone in his household for something he had not authorized, which violated a principle Silas held more deeply than any other, that the sources of good things from his direction were supposed to be traceable back to him. He confronted Eleanor in the kitchen the following morning. She did not deny it. She said the families needed food, and she had provided what she could. She kept her voice level when she said it, because her father had taught her that the voice is the first thing that goes when a person loses their composure. And once it goes, the conversation is no longer yours. Silas told her she was a thief. He told her to get out. But before Eleanor walked to the door, something happened. Silas had pulled open a kitchen drawer to find a piece of paper. He was going to write down what he was owed. He was going to make her sign it. The drawer stuck. He yanked it. The whole drawer came out, and papers spilled across the kitchen floor. Among them was a folded letter, yellow with age, the corners soft. Eleanor saw her father's handwriting. She bent down to pick it up. Silas reached for it, but Eleanor was faster. She unfolded it. She read it. It was a receipt, dated 2 months before her father died. In Edmund Whitcomb's careful schoolteacher handwriting, it said that Edmund had paid Silas Brackett in full the sum of $18 for 1 load of fence posts, paid in full, signed by Silas Brackett himself. Eleanor looked up. Her hands were shaking, but not from cold. There was no debt, she said. Silas's face changed. Give me that paper, girl. There was no debt. You knew. You knew the whole time. I said, give it here. She did not give it to him. She folded it, slowly, with the same careful attention her father had shown her when teaching her to fold a letter properly. And she put it in the canvas bag with everything else she owned. Silas's voice rose. I gave you a roof for 2 years. You owe me. You hear me. You owe me. Eleanor looked at him. She did not speak. She walked past him. She walked out the door. She walked across the yard, where the cold had already started doing its work. And she did not look back, because there was nothing in that direction worth the energy of her eyes. Eleanor walked north, because north was the only direction available to her. South was the town, where the story was already running ahead of her. Like water downhill, east and west were Silas's land. North was the Smoky Ridge. She followed deer trails, because deer trails are the most efficient paths through rough terrain. A fact her father had explained to her when she was 10. She climbed for most of the day. The air thinned. The temperature dropped. By mid-afternoon, she was shaking with cold. That had moved past the uncomfortable stage into something more systemic, the kind of cold that slows thought. She almost didn't see the cave. It was set back from a narrow creek, half hidden behind a curtain of dead Virginia creeper. The opening was roughly 12 feet wide, 8 feet tall, cut into the base of a gray limestone cliff. Eleanor pushed through the Virginia creeper. She stood in the entrance. The cave went back into the rock, farther than she could see in the failing light. The floor was dry packed earth, the walls smooth, pale limestone. The air inside was different. In a way she registered before she could name it. It was still, and it was warmer. She went in. She huddled against the back wall. She slept. She woke for good when gray light was coming through a crack in the ceiling. She was alive, which, at that particular moment, was not nothing. She sat up. Her body ached in places she hadn't known had places. She reached for her canvas bag to check the photograph and the books were dry, and her hand brushed against something hard. Behind her, in the limestone, a loose stone. Not loose like geology, loose like someone had put it there, and someone had taken it out and put it back, more than once. Eleanor pulled the stone away from the wall. There was a hollow behind it. Inside the hollow was a small tin box, the kind that had once held tobacco, painted green. The paint chipped. She lifted it out. Her hands were shaking again. She opened it. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, about the size of her hand, the cover worn soft, the pages full of writing. She knew the handwriting before she read a single word. It was her father's. Her breath caught in her throat. The first entry was dated April 11th, 1931, a year and a half before he died. It said, "I have found a place on the north slope of the ridge that may serve as a refuge if conditions in the hollow continue to deteriorate. The cave is dry, the temperature stable. There is a creek nearby. I will not speak of this to anyone, not yet, but a man who fails to prepare for hard weather is a man who chooses his ending." Eleanor read it twice. Then she turned the page. There were sketches, maps of the ridge, marked with the locations of edible plants, hickory stands, a spring, the path of the creek. And there were instructions, pages of them. How to build a fire pit that vents through a natural crack. How to construct a sleeping platform from green saplings. How to make a soapstone vessel from a deposit on the north fork of the creek. Her father had not just discovered this cave. He had been building this place for her for 2 years before he died. He had been coming up here, in secret, cataloging everything she would need. If something went wrong, if the world he could not protect her from took him before he was finished. Eleanor sat with the notebook open on her lap. The cave around her in gray morning light. Her father had known. Not what would happen, or when, or how. But he had known, the way some men know. That hard weather was coming, and he had refused to leave his daughter without shelter. She did not cry yet. That would come later. What she did was turn to the next page, because her father had left her a textbook, and she had 3 weeks of winter to survive. The first week was the hardest. She rationed what little food she had brought, the handful of dried beans, the piece of cornbread. She drank from the creek. She gathered what the late-season ridge provided: dried persimmons still clinging to bare branches, hickory nuts in the leaf litter, watercress in the cold water of the creek. She nearly died 3 times in those first 3 weeks. The first near death was a fall on an icy slope above the cave. She gashed the outside of her left leg below the knee. She packed it with sphagnum moss from the creek bank, a technique her father had described in his notebook. The second near death was a night in late November when the temperature dropped low enough that Eleanor woke at 2 in the morning, shaking so hard she could not control her own limbs. She piled every piece of dried vegetation against the back wall, burrowed into it, held still. By 4 in the morning, the shaking had subsided. The third near death was the quietest. She had been drinking downstream of a deer carcass for an unknown number of days. 2 days after making this discovery, she was unable to stand without the world tilting sideways. She lay still. She drank water from above the obstruction. 2 days later, she could stand again. She filtered every drop of water she drank after that, through a system she built from a hollow log section, layered sand from the creek bed, and charcoal from her first experimental fires. On the worst nights, Eleanor talked to her mother, not in the way of a person who has lost their hold on what is real, but in the way of a person who has identified a practical use for the imagination. She described what she was going to cook, in the specific terms her mother had taught her, how the heat would transform the proteins in the meat, how the bread she planned to bake, once she had a working oven, would smell in the first 3 minutes after it came out of the heat. Her mother's voice came back, with the texture and authority of lived memory, correcting her on technique, asking questions about quantities. It kept her thinking forward. It kept the project of feeding people alive in her mind, during the weeks when the only person she was feeding was herself. And barely that. She studied the cave the way her father had taught her to study anything, systematically. The inner chamber ceiling crack created a reliable upward draft, drawing air from the outer chamber through the narrowing passage, and up and out into the sky above, which meant a fire built in the right location would vent its smoke naturally. This was the difference between a shelter and a home. She built the fire pit from river rocks, carried up from the creek in multiple trips. She built a sleeping platform from branches, cut with her paring knife. The platform raised her sleeping body 6 inches off the cold earth, which made a difference larger than it had any right to be. She closed the cave entrance with a framework of green saplings lashed together with strips of hickory bark. By the 3rd week, she had a working camp. By the 4th week, she had something more. Then came Christmas Eve. Eleanor did not know it was Christmas Eve, but she knew it was December. And she knew, by something deeper than calendar knowledge, that the night was a holy night. She had been working on the soapstone pots for nearly 3 weeks. Her father's notebook had described the outcrop, approximately 1 mile above the cave on the North Fork. She had found it on her 2nd day of looking. She had been chipping away at it with the paring knife and a sharpened piece of flint she found in the creek bed. Her hands had bled from the work. She had wrapped them in strips torn from the hem of her dress and continued. On the afternoon of December 24th, 1934, she had 2 vessels, rough by any aesthetic standard, but geometrically functional. That afternoon, she had also caught a rabbit in a snare she had set 5 days before. She thanked the rabbit out loud because her mother had taught her that you thank what feeds you. She built the fire up in the late afternoon. She set the soapstone pot on the cooking stone, filled it with creek water she had filtered. She added the rabbit, cut into pieces. She added dried mushrooms, wild onions, hickory nuts she had shelled and roughly chopped, a handful of dried mountain mint. The soup cooked slowly. The heat from the coals beneath the cooking stone moved through the stone, with the same steady patience the cave itself had modeled for her. She did not rush it. She tasted it at intervals and adjusted nothing, because she had no salt and almost no seasoning. But the flavor that was developing was already something more than the sum of its ingredients. When she ate it, sitting on her sleeping platform, with the bowl made from a section of curved bark, with the fire low and the cave warm around her, and the wind outside moving through the bare trees, she cried. She had not cried since her mother died, which had been over 2 years ago. But the soup made her cry, because it tasted the way her mother's kitchen had smelled in the winter, and because she had made it entirely by herself, in a place that no one on earth knew existed. And she was 15 years old, and she was alive, and the soup was good. She sat in the warmth of her own making and ate the soup, and did not apologize for the tears. Eleanor finished the bowl. She set it down. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She looked at the rough soapstone pots and the drying rack with its bundles of herbs, and she thought about what her mother would have called this, what word her mother would have used for the specific arrangement of tools and heat and stored food. Her mother would have called it a kitchen. Eleanor whispered something into the cave that night. Just one thing. 3 words. Mama, I'm here. The fire crackled. The wind outside found the windbreak and could not enter. She slept that night with the canvas bag close to her, the photograph of her mother inside it, the receipt that proved Silas Brackett was a liar, the notebook her father had left her. Outside, the temperature dropped to 12 degrees. Inside, Eleanor Whitcomb slept warm for the first time since November, and the mountain held her, the way mountains hold the things they have decided to keep. Wendell Hartley had lived alone on the north slope of the Smoky Ridge for 11 years. By the time he followed the watercress, he was 73 years old. With the body of a man who had spent most of those years in kitchens, he moved with the particular deliberateness of someone who had learned that economy of motion is not laziness, but craft. He had come to the Ridge in 1924, after 38 years cooking on the Southern Railway dining cars. He had cooked for governors. He had cooked for railroad presidents. And he had cooked for the men who rode the overnight coaches with cardboard in their shoes. He had understood from early in his career that feeding people well was not a neutral act. It changed the quality of the silence after the plates were cleared, the way people looked at each other across a table when his knees finally told him they were done with standing on moving floors. He had come to the mountain because he had wanted. For the first time in his adult life, to cook only for himself. He kept a kitchen garden behind the cabin. He hunted when the season allowed. He fished the creek through the summer. The watercress bed was his. He had not planted it, but he had tended it for 6 years. When he arrived on a Tuesday morning in January of 1935 and found that approximately a third of the bed had been harvested recently and with some care, he did not feel violated. He felt curious. He followed the tracks in the creek bank mud. What the tracks told him was that they had been made by boots that were too large for the feet inside them, which meant either a child or someone wearing borrowed footwear. He followed the direction of departure, which led him along the creek, then up a game trail that switched back twice before leveling onto a narrow bench where a curtain of dead Virginia creeper covered an opening in the rock. That was, on closer inspection, not an opening, but an entrance. He stood in that entrance, and he looked at what was inside. The fire in the pit was low but alive, its coals banked with the kind of deliberate care a person uses when they intend to be away for a while. The cooking stone beside it was clean. The soapstone vessels on the stone shelf were clean. The baskets along the wall were organized by what they contained, with the dried material separated from the fresh by a gap of approximately 6 inches. The drying rack held strips of something that had been cured correctly. The water filtration system, built from the hollow log section, was positioned to drain into a clay-lined catch basin. Wendell had worked in professional kitchens for nearly 4 decades. He had developed over decades a set of standards, against which he measured any cooking space within 30 seconds of entering it. The cave kitchen met his standards in a way that several professional kitchens he had worked in had not, and it had been built by someone with a paring knife from a material that was, technically speaking, a geological formation. He was still standing in the entrance when Eleanor came back through the cave entrance behind him, with a bundle of dried hickory branches under her arm, and stopped. The space between them held a specific quality. 2 people who have each been surprised, each deciding simultaneously how to respond. The decision each of them arrived at independently was not to overreact. Wendell looked at the girl. She was thin. Her hands were rough. She was looking at him with an expression he read as wary, but not frightened. He told her either he had gone crazy or there was a child living in this hole. She straightened slightly. "I'm not a child," she said. "I'm 15. He held the ground on that by saying nothing. Then he looked again at the cooking setup. "Who taught you to cook?" "My mother." "And who taught you all this?" She paused. "My father." "And where are they?" "Gone." He sat down on a rock near the fire. He was quiet for a long time. "I have been cooking for 58 years, he said. "I've never met anyone who could make a kitchen out of a cave." Eleanor said nothing. "Your parents must have been remarkable people." They were. Wendell did not try to take her to town. He did not lecture her about safety or propriety. He had spent enough time around people who knew what they were doing to recognize competence when it was in front of him. He treated her instead the way he would have treated a young cook who had demonstrated genuine ability. He took her seriously. He left that day, without staying long, and he came back 3 days later with a small cloth bag of salt, which he set on the cooking stone without comment. She put a pinch of the salt into a broth she was reducing over the coals. Then she tasted it. He watched her face register the difference. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. That was what was missing, she said. He came back the following week with flour, and the week after that with the cast iron skillet. 3 months passed. The snow melted from the lower slopes. The first hint of green showed itself in the south-facing pockets of the ridge. One evening in late March, sitting at the long table Wendell had helped her drag from the back of the cave, he set down his cup of tea. "Eleanor," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She looked up. "There's something I should have told you," he said. 3 months ago." She waited. He reached into his jacket pocket. He took out a folded piece of paper. It was old, the folds soft from being opened and refolded many times. "Read it." Eleanor unfolded the paper. A letter, dated July 19th, 1932, 2 months before her father died. In her father's handwriting, "Wendell, I write to you because of all the men I have known on the road. You are the one I trust most with what I am about to ask. I have a daughter, Eleanor. She is 13. If anything should happen to me and my wife is unable to care for her, I do not trust the families in this hollow to do right by her. There is a man here named Silas Brackett who has been studying her with the kind of attention that does not come from goodwill. I cannot prove what I suspect, but I have made arrangements for her to have a place of refuge if the worst should come. The cave on the north slope. You know the country. If the time comes, find her. Watch over her if you can. She is the best thing my wife and I have made. Edmund Whitcomb." Eleanor read it twice. She looked up. "You knew." "I knew there was a girl. I did not know where to find her." "How long?" 2.5 years. I have been watching the ridge, the valley, the roads. You were looking for me. I was looking for you." Her hands were shaking. She set the letter down. "Why didn't you tell me?" "The first day." Wendell took a long breath. "Because I needed to see you first. The way you actually were. Not the way a frightened child would behave for a stranger who claimed to know her father. I needed to see what kind of person you had become, without the weight of being watched." "And what kind of person did you see?" "I saw your father's daughter, and I saw your mother's daughter, and I saw a person who has built something out of the worst of what was given to her, and has done it without bitterness. That is rare, Eleanor." Her eyes had started to burn. She blinked it back. "Did he ever know?" "Did he ever know what?" "That you'd come." Wendell looked into the fire for a long moment. "I don't know. I hope he did. The letter took 6 weeks to reach me. By the time I wrote back, he was already gone. I came up to the hollow that fall. But the talk in town was that the Whitcomb girl had been taken in by Silas Brackett, and that Brackett did not welcome callers. I made the wrong decision then. I should have come for you. I have lived with that mistake for 2.5 years. Eleanor did not speak for a long time. When she did, her voice was steady. You came when you could. I came too late. You came at all, which is more than most do. The fire popped. Eleanor reached across the table and laid her rough hand over his. It was the first time in 2 years that she had touched another person with affection. "Will you teach me?" she said. "Teach you what?" "Everything you know. About how to feed people." He looked at her. His eyes were wet. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I will." What followed was the most productive partnership that either of them had ever been part of. Wendell brought knowledge that could not be found in any book Eleanor's father had owned. He knew how to smoke meat so that it was preserved, rather than merely flavored. He showed her how to bank a fire correctly for a long smoke, how to read the color of the smoke, how to tell by pressing a finger against the surface whether the outer layer had formed the right crust. He taught her to render lard from the fat of the wild pigs that moved through the ridge in the late fall. He showed her how to make apple cider vinegar. Eleanor absorbed all of this with the focused, slightly hungry attention of someone who had been thinking about these exact problems for months. But she gave back too. She explained the chemistry, not in a condescending way, but directly, as though the information were simply available. She explained why salt drew moisture from meat by describing osmotic pressure, which she rendered in terms a person who had never studied chemistry could follow. She explained the role of yeast in bread fermentation. He listened with the quality of attention that he had given across 58 years to the very few people who had taught him something genuinely new. They built the bread oven together in the spring of 1935. It took 14 days. The design came from her father's notebook, a description of a stone baking oven common to the rural traditions of the American South and Appalachian Highlands. When the first loaf came out of the finished oven, golden crusted, risen in a way neither of them had been entirely confident the cave conditions would allow, Wendell sat down on the stone bench. He laughed until there was water in his eyes. "I have cooked for governors," he said. "I have never, in my life, baked bread that good." Eleanor cut the loaf with the paring knife. She handed him the larger half. Word traveled. Eleanor had begun, in the late winter of 1935, to do quietly what she had always done: leave food where it was needed, but this time without secrecy, because she no longer lived under another man's roof, and the food she had to give was no longer scraps. It was bread, preserved meat, jars of rendered lard sealed with beeswax. She left the first parcel on the doorstep of a widow named Della Vance, who had 2 children and a third on the way, and whose husband had died in a logging accident the previous September. Della found the parcel at dawn. She unwrapped it on her kitchen table. She fed her children that morning. She wept, and she told no one for 3 days, until her cousin came by and saw the bread and asked where it had come from. By the end of the week, the story was running through Caldwell Hollow. The Whitcomb girl was alive. The Whitcomb girl had built a kitchen on the mountain. The Whitcomb girl was feeding people again. Hattie Pruitt heard it on a Thursday. She was 61 years old, with the small, precise mouth of a woman who had spent her life saying exactly as much as she meant to say. She listened to the news. Her face did not change. She finished ringing up a customer. She walked into the back room, and she stood there for a long time, looking at a photograph on the wall. It was her younger brother, Garrett. He had died in 1908 of pneumonia, 26 years old. What no one in Caldwell Hollow knew, or what most of them had forgotten, was that Garrett Pruitt, in the spring of 1907, had asked Margaret Cresswell to marry him. Margaret Cresswell, who would later become Margaret Whitcomb, Eleanor's mother. She had been 22 then, beautiful in the quiet way that was hard to photograph. She had told Garrett no. 3 months later, she had married Edmund Whitcomb, a schoolteacher from Virginia. Garrett had carried that no for the rest of his short life. When Garrett died the next year, Hattie had decided, without quite deciding, that Margaret Cresswell had killed her brother. It was not true, but true and useful are different things. When Margaret died of typhoid in 1932, some part of Hattie had felt that the books had been balanced. When Silas had asked her in November of 1934 to spread the news that Eleanor Whitcomb was a thief, Hattie had spread it. With the systematic thoroughness of a person who had been waiting 26 years to do exactly this. Now she stood in her back room, looking at her brother's photograph. The girl is still alive. The girl has built something. The girl is being praised for the very thing the mother was praised for. Hattie's face did not change, but her hands, when she put on her coat, were not quite steady. She walked the 4 miles to Silas Brackett's land. She did not knock. Silas was at the table, with a bottle of cheap whiskey. The herd had taken a hit that winter. 24 head dead in a December storm. The man who had walked through life with the certainty of his own importance was beginning to feel for the first time that importance might be a thing the world could revoke. "She's still up there," Hattie said. "Who?" "The Whitcomb girl. She's feeding people." From the mountain. Silas's hand tightened on the bottle. "You said she was a thief," Hattie said. "She is a thief. Then someone should know what's in that bread, Silas. Someone should warn people before children get sick." Silas looked up. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just saying, people don't know what she's putting in there. And she lived under your roof for 2 years. You know what kind of girl she is, don't you?" The two of them looked at each other. Across the kitchen table, two people who had each, for their own reasons, decided that Eleanor Whitcomb deserved to be destroyed. Two people who recognized in each other, for the first time, that they had a partner. The story they built between them spread through the hollow. The Whitcomb girl was poisoning people, not on purpose maybe, but she was a child living in a cave with no proper supplies. Some people believed it. Some people half believed it. Some people did not believe it, but could not say so. A man named Cooper, who had owed Silas money for 3 years, told his wife they would not accept any more bread from the mountain. Eleanor knew about some of these cases through Wendell. About others she did not know, because they simply never appeared. She understood the dynamics involved without bitterness, because her father had taught her that the social mechanisms of small communities are predictable. Then came February of 1937. The winter that year was the worst in a decade. The temperature dropped to 15 below in the third week of January. In the hollow, children developed the kind of hollow eyes Eleanor remembered from her own foraging years. In the cave above, the thermal mass held. The fires burned. The bread came out of the oven golden. But Eleanor knew, from the count of who had stopped coming, that some families would rather starve than be seen accepting from her. The night Della Vance came up the mountain, it was 11 at night. Della had walked 4 miles, carrying her youngest child, Sam, 5 years old. His fever had been climbing for 2 days. The doctor in town would not come without payment. Sam had begun to seize. Della had wrapped him in every blanket she owned, and she had walked. Eleanor heard her coming up the path before she saw her, recognized the sound of someone moving fast on the trail in the dark, and was at the cave entrance when Della came into the small clearing. She handed the boy to Eleanor without a word. Eleanor took him to the fire. She assessed him, the way her father had taught her to assess an ill person, systematically, without projecting the worst case onto the evidence. The fever was high. The child was responsive, not yet delirious. His breathing was clear. She put water onto heat. When it reached the right temperature, she made a preparation from the dried herbs she kept in the inner chamber. Wild garlic for its antimicrobial properties, mountain mint for fever reduction, a small amount of dried boneset. She fed it to the child in small sips over the course of 2 hours, while the fire was built up and the cave temperature rose. She told Della what each herb was, and what it did, and why. Because she understood that a person in crisis needs something to hold on to, and that understanding is a thing to hold. By 3 in the morning, the fever had broken, not dramatically, but gradually, in the way a real fever breaks, the child sweating through his blankets, then quieting, then sleeping with the profound unconsciousness of a body that has stopped fighting. Della Vance sat across the fire from Eleanor, with her hands around a clay cup of warm water. Eleanor was 17 now, but she carried herself with the settled quality of someone much older. Della spoke for the first time. They said the bread was poisoned. I know. I did not believe it. But my husband's brother, he said, we should not eat from her. It's all right, Della. It is not all right. My boy could have died because I listened to fools. Eleanor put another log on the fire. You are here now. I am here now, Della said. She looked at the boy, sleeping in his warm blankets on the platform. What was in the medicine? Plants from this mountain. The same plants Silas Brackett has been walking past for 30 years, without knowing what they could do. Della looked up. Her eyes were wet. Tell me what they were, so I can tell my mother. so she can use them, so her grandchildren do not die from things we already had the answer to. Eleanor took a slow breath. She told her. Della went down the mountain in the gray early morning, carrying her son, who slept the whole way. She stopped at her sister's house first. Then she walked to her cousin's farm. Then she walked to the church, where the women were preparing for the Sunday service, and she stood in front of them, with the boy still wrapped in his blankets, and she told them. She did not editorialize. The facts were sufficient. By Sunday evening, the story had reached every household in the hollow with a telephone or a neighbor who had one. By Tuesday, the first family came up the mountain again. By Friday, there were 12. By the following Sunday, there were 30. And the kitchen days resumed, bigger than they had been, because now they had the weight of testimony behind them, from a woman whose child had nearly died. Hattie Pruitt heard the new story by the end of the second week. She closed her store early that day. She did not tell anyone why. She walked out the back, the same way she had walked when she had first decided to spread the lie. But she did not walk to Silas's land this time. She walked to her brother's grave, in the small cemetery behind the Methodist church. She had not visited it in 14 years. She stood in front of the headstone, and she did not speak, because there was no one alive who could hear her. But something in her face, as she stood there in the cold March air, was the look of a woman beginning to understand that she had spent 30 years carrying a wound that had been hers to set down. She did not stop spreading her stories about Eleanor that day. That would come later. But the wall in her had cracked, and cracks, once they appear, tend to do their own work. Spring came. The terraces went in. Eleanor and Wendell built 4 levels of retaining walls below the cave entrance. They planted the terraces with seed Eleanor had been saving, stored in clay seal containers she had made over the winter. In June, Eleanor traded for 2 goats from a widow named Mrs. Greaves on the next ridge over. By August, she was making cheese. The first wheel smelled wrong before it was ready. Contamination at the pressing stage. The second batch did not set. Wrong temperature on the milk. The third was good. Mild, clean. Holding under a knife. She set it on the long table the next Saturday. 26 people ate from that wheel. By the end of 1937, the cave kitchen was producing more food than 2 people could eat. This was not an accident. Eleanor had planned it. Though she had not announced the plan, even to Wendell. She stood looking at her storage shelves one November morning, the lined-up jars, the smoked meats wrapped and stacked, the rounds of cheese aging in the inner chamber. The decision was not to start giving food away. She had never stopped wanting to do that. The decision was to start giving something harder to take away than food, which was the understanding of how to produce it. Wendell came up to the cave that Saturday. He sat on the stone bench with his coffee. He watched her demonstrate the correct way to score a sourdough loaf to a young woman from the east side of the hollow. Eleanor's hands moved over the dough, and the young woman's hands began to move over her own dough, in imitation. Then, in understanding, Wendell watched. He set his coffee down. He did not say what he was thinking. What he was thinking was that he had been brought to this mountain to do exactly this work, with exactly this girl, for exactly this hour, and every step of the 73 years before had been preparation in a cave that her father had left her like a love letter. He had not known until that moment that a man's life could be circular. He thought he would have time to tell Eleanor what this had meant to him. He thought he would have time. He did not. It was a Tuesday morning in late April of 1938. Wendell did not come down for his usual breakfast. The neighbor who lived on the other side of the ridge came by his cabin around 10. Saw the smoke not rising from the chimney, knocked on the door, found him in his bed, in his sleep, sometime in the night. Eleanor walked the 2 miles to his cabin when she heard. She sat beside him for a while, in the way that the people he had cooked for all his life had never had occasion to sit beside him, with no one watching, no transaction pending, just the plain acknowledgement of what he had been. The cast-iron skillet was on the cabin's cook stove. Looking at it was harder than she had expected. She had not known until that moment of his absence how completely she had come to rely on his presence, not for the practical things he brought and did, not for the specific knowledge he had given her, but for the way. He had seen her clearly from the first moment, and had simply treated what he saw as worthy of his full respect. He left her everything he had. The cast-iron cookware, complete, seasoned. The notebooks, in which he had recorded 40 years of recipes, and a letter. She read it that night, by the fire in the cave. He told her she was the finest cook he had ever known, and that what made her exceptional was not her technical mastery, but her understanding of what food was actually for, which was to bring people toward each other and to repair the things that life breaks, and that she should not, ever, stop. Then he wrote one more thing, below the signature, almost as an afterthought. Eleanor, your father asked me to watch over you. But the truth is, you saved this old man from a quiet ending. You gave me 3 years of purpose I had not earned and did not deserve. Thank you for letting me into your kitchen and into your life. The bread was the smallest part. W. Eleanor folded the letter with the careful precision she had inherited from her father. She put it in the canvas bag, the bag she had carried out of Silas Brackett's yard 3.5 years before. She put it in with the photograph of her mother, the receipt, her father's notebook, because it belonged with those things, the things that constituted the actual material of who she was. She walked back to the cave as the afternoon light moved down the ridge. In the morning, she fired the oven earlier than usual. She baked through the morning without particular purpose, beyond the fact that the baking needed to be done. She was 18 years old and alone again, except she wasn't. 2 days later, the first kitchen day after Wendell's death, 41 people came up the mountain. They brought wildflowers from the lower slopes. They set them on the long table. without being asked, because the women in Caldwell Hollow had heard that the old man on the North Ridge had been like a father to the Whitcomb girl, and that the Whitcomb girl was alone, and the women had decided that the Whitcomb girl would not be alone while they were on the mountain. Eleanor walked among them, filling bowls, demonstrating technique, answering questions, and inside her chest, something held. That had not held the day before. The chain her father had started, that her mother had extended, that Wendell had carried for 3 years, was now in her hands alone. But it was still a chain, and every link in it was still alive. Caleb Ashworth came up the mountain on a Tuesday in April of 1940 with a flatbed wagon loaded with white oak lumber. He was 26 years old, lean through the shoulders, with the particular steadiness of movement that belongs to carpenters, who have learned that the difference between good work and poor work is almost always a question of patience, rather than skill. He had grown up in Harlan County, 40 miles to the northeast. His father had left when Caleb was 12. Caleb had understood by 14 that the absence was permanent. He had put himself through 2 years of the agricultural college at Knoxville on a combination of work-study arrangements and the kind of stubbornness that functions as a financial strategy. When the money had finally run out, he had taken the incomplete education and applied it to the available work, which was carpentry, because wood, unlike most of the other things in his life up to that point, behaved according to rules that rewarded careful attention. The lumber order had been placed by Wendell Hartley the previous October. Wendell had ordered it and paid the deposit. For a storage extension he had been planning, he had died before the lumber could be delivered. The mill in Knoxville, after waiting a reasonable interval, had reissued the delivery to the next of kin. The order had listed Eleanor Whitcomb. Caleb followed the directions. He came around the last bend in the trail. He stopped. He had been told there was a cave. What he saw was not a cave with a girl living in it. What he saw was an operating farm, organized around a cave as its central structure, with terrace gardens descending the hillside in 4 levels. The smokehouse stood to the left, dry stacked stone, with a fitted cap. The spring house sat below the terraces. The cold frames along the south-facing wall were salvaged glass and timber. Through the glass he could see green growing things. In April, in the Tennessee mountains, Eleanor came out of the cave entrance when she heard the wagon. She was 20 years old, and she carried herself with the particular settled quality that comes not from age or from ease, but from having been tested repeatedly by difficult circumstances and having been each time adequate to them. She came down the path. "You have a delivery," she said. "I have." "For Wendell Hartley." "Yes, ma'am." "He died 2 years ago." "Yes, ma'am." The mill said, "The order was made out to you." After. She looked at the lumber. Quality wood, white oak, cut clean, well stacked. He ordered this for an extension on the north side of the cave entrance. That's so. He never told me what he was planning to build with it. I'd guess. From the dimensions of the cuts, he was building a storage room for cured meats, with a separate compartment for cheese aging, different ventilation requirements. She looked up sharp. You can tell that from the lumber. I can tell that from the lumber. She studied him. He did not perform under being studied, which was something she noticed. Are you a carpenter? I am. Do you have other work? Job in the next county. Starts in 3 weeks. Do you want work for those 3 weeks? He looked at the cave, the terraces, the smokehouse. He looked back at her. What would you pay? Food. Bed in the small cabin behind the spring house. And whatever Wendell would have paid you. He thought about it. All right, he said. He did not leave at the end of 3 weeks. He finished the storage extension. He hung a proper door on the existing cold storage room. He built a set of benches for the teaching kitchen, sized correctly for adults. When those were done, he looked at the teaching kitchen, and he identified 4 additional improvements. He named these to Eleanor in the direct way she had come to expect, presenting them as observations rather than suggestions. Build them, she said. He built them. When those were done, there were other things. He ate at the cave's long table with the kitchen day students on Saturdays. He did not make himself the center of any room he was in, which Eleanor registered as the quality she had found most consistently absent in the men she had dealt with across her life. 3 weeks became 3 months. In June, he was still there. In July, he was still there. One evening in August, they sat at the long table after the week's kitchen day had ended. The students had gone home. The fire was low. Caleb spoke. Why don't you charge? For what? For what you teach. She looked at him. The people who come don't have money. Some of them do. Mrs. Tilden, the Crandalls, they have money. They have a little, enough to pay something. And the others can't. Then I'd be charging some and not others for the same work, which would be a lie about the work. So the price has to be the same, and the only price I can hold to is none. He thought about that. That requires you to absorb the cost yourself. It does. There's a limit to how long you can do that. There is. What happens when you reach it? She poured the last of the coffee from the pot. She did not answer immediately. My father did not charge me for what he taught me. My mother did not charge me. Wendell did not charge me. The mountain did not charge me. The knowledge came through a chain. If I put a price on it now, I break the chain. He was quiet for a long moment. All right, he said. All right what? All right. The chain matters more than the cost. I won't ask again. He stayed. In November, he went back to Harlan County to settle the practical matters of his life there, which took 3 weeks. He came back to the ridge in December with his tools and his books. By February of 1941, they were working side by side every day. By March, he had moved his tools into the workshop he was building along the north wall of the cave entrance. By April, he had asked her. He had not gotten down on a knee. He had simply finished sanding a piece of curly maple he had been working on for 2 weeks, and he had set it on the long table where she was kneading dough. It was a small box. Inside the box, a pair of rings, carved from the same piece of black walnut, heartwood, polished to a soft, warm gleam. She looked at the rings, then at him. He said, "I would like to stay here, with you, for the rest of my life." She looked at the rings again. Then she said, "Yes." She did not say it loudly. She said it the way she said most things, quietly and without any doubt. They were married on the second Saturday of May in 1941 at the cave. 60 people crowded into the cave and the space outside and the upper terrace. Both ovens were loaded. Wendell's cast iron cookware was in use on every available surface. Eleanor wore her mother's wedding dress. Margaret had worn it in 1907. Eleanor wore it in 1941. Caleb wore the only suit he owned, which had been his grandfather's. The minister was a kitchen day student named Reverend Pell. When Caleb slipped the walnut ring onto Eleanor's finger, his hands were steady, and hers were not. She cried into Caleb's shoulder. For her parents who could not see this. For Wendell who had not lived to see this. For the girl in the cold yard who had not believed that a day like this would ever come for her. Caleb held her. He did not say anything, because he had already learned that sometimes Eleanor did not need words. She just needed someone to hold the ground until she could stand on it again. Caleb built what he built. Over the following years, the dining hall went up first, a stone structure attached to the cave entrance, with a soaring central fireplace. The teaching kitchen came next, a dedicated space with 12 working stations. He added storage buildings, a series of small guest cabins along the ridgeline. He built a proper road from the valley floor to the cave. 3 months of the hardest single work he undertook. When it was finished, Eleanor stood at the bottom and looked up at it. "It's a good road," she said. He knew she meant something by it. They had 3 children across the 1940s, 2 sons, and a daughter named Ruth. Ruth could shape a loaf before she could write her name. She knew the difference between a properly proofed dough and an underproofed one, by touch, before she was 6. Then came the autumn of 1946. Silas Brackett was 68 years old by then, and he had been diminished by the years since 1937, in the specific way of men whose identity is inseparable from what they own, so that the loss of the property is also, and simultaneously, the loss of the self. The cattle operation was gone. The 3,000 acres had been sold in pieces over 9 years. His wife had left in 1942 for her sister's house in Knoxville. He was living in a rented room above the old general store. He was hungry. In the plain physical sense of the word, the hunger had stripped away the various layers of self-presentation and left him with something closer to the bare fact of himself, which was a man who had been wrong about many things for a long time. He came up the mountain in early October, alone. He stood at the edge of the clearing above the new road's end, holding his hat in both hands, in the way of a man who does not know what to do with his hands. He looked at the cave entrance, the dining hall, the gardens. He had known this place existed for 9 years. In those 9 years, he had driven past it many times and arrived each time at the same stopping point, which was the distance between what he had done and the act of walking toward what it had produced. Eleanor saw him from the teaching kitchen doorway. She recognized him immediately, not because he looked the same. He did not. But because some people are recognizable, regardless of what time does to them. She came out of the teaching kitchen. She crossed the clearing toward him at her ordinary pace, without urgency, without hesitation. He looked at the ground. His voice, when he found it, had the particular roughness of a voice. That has not been used much recently. Eleanor, Silas, He stopped, started over. I came to say. He stopped again. He pressed his hat against his chest, like he was trying to hold something inside that was trying to come out. I came to say I was wrong about you. I was wrong about everything. She waited. She did not help him, because she had learned that the words a person needs to say have to come from inside that person, or they don't count. Your father, Silas said. His voice broke. Your father saved my life. Eleanor's face changed. He saw it change. He kept going, because if he stopped now, he would never start again. It was 1908. I was 30 years old. I'd been drinking at a tavern down by the Holston River. I thought I could swim across to a girl on the other side. I went in. The current took me. I went under twice. The third time I went under. I knew I wasn't coming back up. And then someone had me by the collar of my shirt, pulling me toward the bank. It was a man I had never seen before, a young man, visiting his mother's relatives in the next county over. He pulled me out. He gave me his coat. He sat with me until I stopped vomiting river water. And then he told me his name. Silas could not speak for a moment. He told me his name was Edmund Whitcomb. Eleanor felt her hand go to her mouth. Silas kept going. I owed your father my life. I never told him. He moved away. I didn't know how to find him. 25 years went by. Then he came back to the hollow with a wife and a daughter. I should have walked up to him on the first day and said, You save me. Whatever you need, whatever I have, I owe it to you. Silas's hands were shaking now. I didn't, because I had built myself into a man who never owed anyone anything. I had told that story to so many people over the years, about the great Silas Brackett who didn't need anything from anyone, that I couldn't go back and tell the truth. So I said nothing. And then he died. And I told myself I would settle it through the daughter. I told myself I was helping. I told myself the lie about the debt, the $18. I needed a reason, any reason. to bring you under my roof so I could feel that I was paying him back. His voice cracked. But I was not paying him back. I was punishing you for being his daughter, for being the proof of how badly I had failed to be the man he had been to me. I was small around you. I was small because I was a small man, and I knew it, and I could not bear to know it, so I made you bear it instead. He stopped. He could not continue. He stood in the cold October air, holding his hat, crying, for the first time since he had been a boy. Eleanor did not move for a long time, because every part of her wanted to step back, wanted to refuse this, wanted to tell him the apology was 12 years too late. She felt the canvas bag in her mind, the receipt inside it. She thought of her mother, of the soup he had dumped on the ground, of the cold yard. And then she thought of her father, of Edmund Whitcomb, who had pulled a 30-year-old drunk out of the Holston River in 1908, who had not asked his name, who had not asked for thanks, who had simply done what was in front of him to do. Because he was a man who did what was in front of him to do. Eleanor took a breath. She stepped forward. She reached out. She put her hand on Silas Brackett's shoulder. He flinched, like he had not expected to be touched ever again. "Come inside," she said. "Eleanor, come inside, Silas. The soup is hot." She turned. She walked toward the dining hall. He followed her, slowly, the way a man follows when he does not know if his legs will carry him there. She led him to the long table. She brought him a bowl of white bean soup with a piece of cornbread on the side. She set it down in front of him, without ceremony, because she had understood for years that the power of feeding someone is precisely in its ordinariness. You are a person who needs to eat. I am a person who has food. The distance between those two facts is the distance I am choosing to close. He ate, with his eyes on the bowl. The dozen people in the dining hall that afternoon witnessed it, without comment. When the bowl was empty, Silas spoke, almost too quietly to hear. "Your father would have done this for me." Eleanor sat down across from him. "My father did do this for you," she said. "He did it in 1908. I am only finishing what he started." Silas became a regular presence at the cave kitchen after that autumn, not as a student, not as a helper in any formal sense, but in the way that people who need a place to be find a place to be. He sat at the long table on Saturday mornings. He drank coffee. He was quiet. And when the men who came up from the valley asked him what he thought of Eleanor's kitchen, his answer was always the same. "She is the finest cook I have ever known, and I was a fool who could not see it. And that is all I have to say." That was always enough. Hattie Pruitt never came up the mountain. But in the spring of 1947, she closed her store one Tuesday afternoon, and she walked the 4 miles. And she stood at the bottom of the road, looking up, for about an hour, without going further. Then she walked back to her store. She opened it the next morning, and she did not say a single negative word about Eleanor Whitcomb for the rest of her life. Some accounts she never settled, but the worst of them, she stopped paying interest on. The years passed. The cave grew. The terraces extended. In the 1950s, a state representative arrived with a citation for community service. In 1963, a professor named Dr. Crane wrote a paper that was published in the Journal of Agricultural History. In the 1970s, young people started arriving from California and Vermont and Ohio, looking for what they called the back-to-the-land life. Eleanor taught them all, without changing her method for any of them, because the method was the method. And the people who came because they needed what she had, not because she needed them to come. Then came November of 1971. A Tuesday morning. Caleb had been in the workshop he had built 30 years earlier, the tools all in their places. He had been laying out a cold frame for the lower terrace. In the failing October light the night before, he had not finished it. He had set it on the work table, ready for the glazing. Eleanor found him in the workshop at 7:14 a.m., November 9th, 1971. He was sitting against the wall, his back to the workbench. His hand was open, like he had been reaching for something, and had stopped halfway through. His face did not look surprised. It looked the way Caleb looked, when he was thinking about something he could not quite work out. She sat with him for a long time. She did not call out, because she understood that whatever was needed in this room was already finished. The doctor came up the mountain at noon. Heart attack. Sudden. No warning. 26 years old when she had met him. 57 years old when she lost him. She buried him on the ridge above the cave, near the hickory stand, where they had stood together the first morning after their wedding, and he had pointed and said, "Someday, we're gonna put a bench up here so we can come and sit and listen to the woods." She had Ruth and the boys and 41 people from the valley at the burial. She did not say anything at the service. She had never been a public speaker. After the others had gone, she stayed. She sat on the ground beside the fresh dirt. She put her hand on it. She stayed until dark. She walked back down to the cave alone. She fired the oven the next morning at 5. The way she had every morning of her adult life, because the bread was the work, and the work did not stop. Even when the world changed shape, she continued. This is not a simple statement. It describes an act of will that is invisible from the outside, because it does not produce dramatic events, only continued presence and continued work. She continued teaching through the 1970s with the help of Ruth. She continued baking bread every morning. Her arthritis became serious in her late 50s. She could no longer knead dough when she was 60. She knew it on the morning she tried. She felt the absence of the strength it required. She understood it was not coming back. She sat in the chair Caleb had built her years ago. She positioned it beside the oven. She talked Ruth through every step of the morning bread, with the precision of a person who has done something 10,000 times. Ruth's hands moved through the dough. Eleanor's voice moved through the morning. The bread that came out of the oven was, as far as anyone who tasted it could tell, the same bread that had been coming out of that oven for decades. It was the autumn of 1981. Eleanor was 61. One Saturday afternoon, after the kitchen day students had gone home, Ruth was sweeping the dining hall. Eleanor was sitting in her chair near the fire, her eyes closed, her hands folded in her lap. Ruth went into the small storage closet at the back of the dining hall to put the broom away. She had done this 1,000 times. She had never noticed the loose board behind the shelf. That afternoon, she bumped it. It came free. Behind it, there was a small wooden box. Ruth pulled the box out. Cherry wood. The lid sanded smooth and finished with linseed oil. She knew the wood. It was Caleb's work. She knew because she had grown up watching her father's hands, and she could tell his work from any other carpenter's, the way some people tell handwriting. She brought the box to her mother. Eleanor opened her eyes. She looked at the box. She looked at Ruth. She did not speak. Ruth did not speak. Eleanor opened the box. Inside, a folded piece of paper. The folds soft. She unfolded it. A letter. Dated April 15th, 1940. 3 days after Caleb had arrived at the cave for the first time. Written in his hand. Eleanor, I do not know yet whether I will give you this letter. I do not know yet whether I will stay. I do not know yet whether you will want me to stay. But I have been here 3 days, and I have to put down what I am thinking, or I will lose it. I came up here this week to deliver lumber, and I came around the bend in the trail, and I saw what you had made. And I have not been able to think clearly since. I have spent my life trying to build things that were good enough to last. You have built something that is good enough to last. I have spent my life working alone. You have spent yours working alone too. I think we recognized each other the first day, before either of us said anything. The way two people recognize each other when they have been doing the same hard thing on different sides of a mountain and finally meet. I do not know if I will have the courage to ask you what I want to ask you, but I wanted to write down so that someone has it that I would build 1,000 storage rooms for you. I would build a road up to this cave. I would build a dining hall and a teaching kitchen and guest cabins and anything else you needed for the rest of my life. And I would never, not once, ask for credit for any of it, because the credit is yours. The work is yours. The chain is yours. I would only ask to stand near the fire you have built and to be allowed to love you. And if I do not have the courage to give you this letter, then I am writing it so that one day, after we are old, after our children are grown, you will find it and know that from the third day I knew. Eleanor folded the letter. She did not cry immediately. She set the letter in her lap. She looked out the window of the dining hall, at the trees on the ridge. She had never counted them before, but she knew, without counting, how many there were. 40. Caleb had planted one black walnut tree on the ridge above the cave every spring from 1941 to 1980. She had thought he was just being a carpenter, building shade, making the property beautiful. She had not understood until that moment that he had been keeping count of the years, each tree, a year of their marriage, each tree, a letter he had not needed to write, because he had planted it instead. 40 trees, 40 years. Eleanor pressed the letter to her face, and then she cried, in the way of a woman who has loved one man for 40 years and has just discovered that she was loved back in a way she had not even known to hope for. Eleanor died on a morning in March of 1982. In the cabin Caleb had built her beside the cave, in her sleep, in the early gray light, before the birds had started, which was the time of day she had always been awake for. She was 62 years old. Ruth found her at 6 in the morning. She came to begin the day's bread. She sat with her mother for a while, before she did anything else, in the way Eleanor had taught her to sit, with the important things, before moving on to the necessary ones. More than 300 people came to the funeral, from the hollows and valleys and ridge communities of 3 counties. Some traveled considerable distances on the kind of march roads that eastern Tennessee produces, which are not always easy. They came because she had fed them, or because she had taught them, or because their parents had been fed and taught, and they understood, having grown up with the results of that feeding and teaching, that they were there because of her, in a way that was more than metaphorical. The burial was on the ridge above the cave, near Caleb, in the hickory stand, beneath one of the 40 walnut trees. The minister was the granddaughter of Reverend Pell, who had married Eleanor and Caleb 41 years earlier. She said, as part of the service, that Eleanor Whitcomb had known what food was for, and she had never, once, stopped acting on that knowledge, and that the world she was leaving was measurably better fed than the world she had entered. The cave is still there. The limestone walls still hold the temperature they have always held, 55 degrees in every season. The hickory stand on the ridge above produces nuts in the fall. The terraces, rebuilt and extended over the decades, still produce through 9 months of the year. The spring house runs cold and clean from the seep that is not diminished. The bread oven stands in its original location. The limestone blocks and the clay ash mortar now darkened with decades of heat and use, to a color that is not quite any other color, something between iron and earth. They fire it every Saturday morning at 5, which is when Eleanor always fired it. The same progression from kindling to small wood to the large splits that bring the dome to temperature. The same way of testing the heat by the behavior of a handful of flour thrown against the dome's interior, which should darken in 3 seconds if the oven is ready. The sourdough starter is still alive. It has been alive continuously since the night Eleanor's mother died in 1932, when a 13-year-old girl sat in a kitchen in Caldwell Hollow, and without quite making a decision, decided that something was alive and needed tending, and she would tend it. It has been fed every morning through a marriage, and its loss through 3 children and 5 grandchildren, through the teaching of more than 400 people, through the death of everyone who had been alive when it was started. The bread it makes is what people say it is. There is something in it that resists the kind of description that satisfies. People who eat it for the first time sometimes become quiet in a way that is not about the eating. They are tasting something that was made by stubbornness and by grief and by the specific intelligence of a girl who understood that the best response to being told you were worthless was to spend your life producing something of irreducible value and give it away to everyone who was hungry enough to need it on Saturday mornings when the oven is fired and the starter has been fed and the first loaves are proofing on the stone shelf in the teaching kitchen, and the smell of wood smoke and fermentation, and the particular warmth of a place that has been consistently used for good purposes, is moving through the cave, and out the entrance, and down the terraces, and into the cool morning air of the smoky ridge. There is something present that has no name in the conventional vocabulary, but that everyone who has spent time in the cave knows how to recognize. It is the accumulated consequence of a single decision made in a freezing yard in November of 1934, which was the decision to walk north instead of lying down. And of the 10,000 decisions that followed from it, each one made by a girl, and then a woman who knew, without requiring it to be confirmed by anyone, that she understood what food was for, and that understanding it was enough. The 40 walnut trees still stand. They are tall now, older than most of the people who walk under them. In April, their leaves come in late, the way walnut leaves always do. And in October, their leaves fall in a particular pattern that looks, to anyone walking the ridge, like a circle of gold around the place where 2 graves lie, side by side, Eleanor and Caleb, Wendell beside them, 3 rows over, 3 people who once, in a particular spring, in a particular cave, decided that they were going to feed everyone who came, and who never once stopped. And the bread comes out of the oven every Saturday morning, golden, the way bread does when it has been made by people who understood what it was for.